Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Hope you're staying home, wearing your masks, washing your hands, and generally taking good care of yourselves. My guests today are Omri Nahmias and Alan Schneider. Omri Nahmias is the Jerusalem Post's Washington correspondent covering U.S.-Israel relations, Israel-related legislation in Congress, and the 2020 presidential election. In his role, Omri maintains relationships with senior White House officials, members of Congress, and Israeli diplomats. Before joining the Jerusalem Post last year, Omri was Walla News' Washington bureau chief, covering the 2016 presidential election. He previously covered the Knesset for Walla News as their political correspondent for 6 years, during which time he gained a keen understanding of the inner workings of Israeli politics. Alan Schneider is the director of the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem, which serves as the hub of B'nai B'rith International's activities in Israel. Under Alan's leadership, the World Center has become the key link between Israel and B'nai B'rith members and supporters around the world. Alan has developed many important relationships with members of the Knesset that are essential for the center's work and has been instrumental in arranging missions to Israel for UN diplomats and members of the European Parliament. He's also a founding member of the committee to recognize the heroism of Jewish rescuers during the Holocaust, which was the theme of the recent Yom HaShoah commemoration. In our conversation today, I'll be speaking with Omri and Alan about how Israel's rival political leaders, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, came to an agreement to form an emergency unity government and the details of the agreement. We'll also discuss the events leading up to this agreement, including 3 straight national elections, as well as the short-term and long-term implications of forming a unity government as Israel confronts the outbreak of the coronavirus. So, Alan and Omri, thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for hosting us.
Yeah, well, we're talking, today, Yom HaZikaron is literally beginning in Israel as we're having this conversation, which is the day to commemorate Israel's fallen in all of its wars and its war on terrorism. And of course, the day after will be Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's National Independence Day. And so as we see that as a backdrop, we'll begin our discussion about a national unity emergency government. So, Omri, why don't you kick this off by telling us where we stand today, and then we can talk. Alan, get your take on this as well, and then we'll talk about possibilities and options going forward.
So, I think that today we are much closer to have a unity government than we were like 3 or 4 weeks ago. However, we're not quite there yet. There are still a few gaps between the two sides and a few legal challenges because forming this new idea of emergency government when you sworn in 2 heads of 2 prime ministers at the same time in the Knesset and anchoring a legal situation in which you decide the date that the second prime minister is going to serve is something very complicated that never been done in Israel and requires a few steps of legislation that is now taking place in the Knesset, and at the same time it's also being challenged at the Supreme Court. And I think that, both Netanyahu and Gantz are pretty suspicious to each other. They wanted to join forces and to join to this emergency government, but I don't think they trust each other yet. And therefore, you see this really unprecedented document that really anchoring each and every scenario that could happen during the next 3 years. And by the way, it's going to be a government only for 3 years and not for 4 years, which is also something unprecedented. So we're facing something, uncharted territory. But in many aspects, it seems like that we are way closer today to have a new government than we were like a few weeks ago.
But Alan, this is, even with all of the difficulties, this is something that most Israelis wanted. We've been through 3 elections, been through a lot of back and forth over a year. And so how are Israelis reacting now to? I mean, is there some impatience because this is something really that most people want?
Yeah, well, there is a lot of impatience, I think, and Omri touched on the point here that it's a very delicate agreement that's coming together, and it's not clear if it will be allowed by the court even to pass, and also what the position of the Attorney General will be regarding this agreement. Oh, and so there's still a lot of pieces in play. I do think that there is that the detail of this agreement shows how much distrust there is between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu. They're not going into this with a lot of backslapping and hugging and trust between them. So I think we're looking at a very tentative kind of situation where Netanyahu also has not yet brought in one of his main coalition partners, which is Yamina, and what role they will play in the upcoming coalition. So there are a lot of pieces that still need to fall into place before this actually becomes a reality.
So even in the court, with all of the adjudication of these issues, people are still talking about forming a cabinet and handing portfolios. And one of the aspects of this agreement is this large number of cabinet members. And I know there have been Israeli cabinets in the past that have been quite large to accommodate the political needs of the parties involved in a coalition. But here I think we're talking about, perhaps you can help me with the numbers, I think in excess of 30 cabinet members, and then there's some deputy.
32 cabinet members and 16 deputies.
16 deputies, so we're talking 48 out of 120. So you have a lot of positions here.
But that's of course because even though Netanyahu will have a much bigger part of the cabinet of the government, still they agreed. The principle is that there will be parity in the number of ministers and deputy ministers between the Netanyahu's bloc and Gantz's bloc, and so that is also filtered into this problem that they have in maintaining that parity of ministers and deputy ministers, even though in the Knesset the voting power of both blocs are very different, and Netanyahu will have double the votes in his bloc than Gantz.
So Omri, there are those cabinet positions that those of us in the diaspora, of course, know best. Defense minister, foreign minister, finance minister, justice minister. Basically, I think those are the main portfolios that we see from here. Are there clear favorites for the holders of those positions?
So from what we know now, it's really interesting the way they decided to divide the portfolios between the two large parties. First of all, there are going to be a few check and balances, which mean Avi Nissankoren from Blue and White is expected to be the next justice minister, which is really like a really important position, and also gives him a seat on the security cabinet. However, they decided that on key appointments, you will need agreement from both Netanyahu and Gantz, and it's going to stay the same way for the next 3 years. So Nissankoren is expected to be justice minister, and they're talking about Gabi Ashkenazi as the next foreign minister. However, there is some public pressure brewing about health ministry in this, this coronavirus pandemic, and after the current minister, Yaakov Litzman, made clear that he's not going to stay in his position and he wants to pursue the housing ministry. There are people who are making the case then if it is in fact an emergency government, Blue and White should take health ministry. So we don't know exactly how things are going to play out, but as of now, Gabi Ashkenazi is expected to be the foreign ministry, and also Blue and White are going to hold a number of other key positions as communication ministry. And we should note that they handed two cabinet positions to Labour Party, which on Sunday voted in favor of joining the government, and they signed their coalition agreement with Benny Gantz. So it's a very delicate situation. You have only 12 cabinet positions to give to Likud ministers. Many of them are expected to become ministers in the next government, so we don't know exactly who is going to fill each position, and we know that many of them, are certainly expecting Netanyahu to appoint them. So the next few weeks are going to be pretty tense in Likud.
Alan, anything on that point?
Well, regarding the health ministry, one of the candidates who's been raised as a possible minister is Ayelet Shaked, the former justice minister, and that would be the way of bringing, now that Litzman has bowed out of that position, that one way of bringing Yamina into the coalition would be to offer that position to Ayelet Shaked. So there's a whole musical chairs that's going on. There's, of course, also the role of ambassador in the United States and at the UN, both positions that are up for new appointments. So it's not impossible that some of the sitting ministers now would go to fill those posts in the United States.
So what's your guess going forward on when this will begin to gel? When will this all come together? We're here now, and you've had discussions now for a number of days since it was first announced that this was going to happen. What do you see in the near term?
So the schedule is pretty tight. They have only about 14 days or so, correct me if I'm wrong, Ellen, to form the new coalition before, we are heading automatically to a new round of elections, which, as crazy as it may sound, it's still a possibility that we'll face a fourth round of elections if they're not able to finalize the agreement by then. So we have a very tight schedule. President Rivlin decided not to give the mandate to another candidate, but to skip directly to the Knesset, try to urge the sides, to push the sides together to make a decision. And I think the 2 next weeks are really crucial. And you should also keep in mind that they need to finish some really complicated legislation on the Knesset. And Avi Nissan-Cohen, which is again expected to be the next justice minister, is the one who is handling the Knesset committee and behind the scenes to promote this legislation, but he is not very experienced in the Knesset, in the legislative process. And Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, and Bogi Elon, who are part of Blue and White, are doing whatever they can to try and postpone this legislation. In long hours of debates, and in Israel it's called filibuster. It's a bit different than the American version of filibuster, but they're trying to do whatever they can to postpone this process. So Blue and White will need to prove in the next 2 weeks that they can deliver on that.
Go ahead, Alan. You want to say what?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that, Yair Lapid today threw a monkey wrench into this whole process by promising that he would vote with Netanyahu when the 18 months runs out of his position, because, they agreed to a rotation of those 3 years, so there'd be an 18 months for Netanyahu and then another 18 for Gantz. But Yair Lapid today said that he would vote with Netanyahu to derail this whole process of allowing Gantz to take over as prime minister, and basically rescinding all of this new legislation that would allow for that. So that if in 18 months' time, Netanyahu would want to prevent Gantz from taking over as prime minister, as I say today, Yair Lapid said that he would vote with Netanyahu, with his arch rival Netanyahu, in order to prevent Gantz from becoming prime minister. That's the level of animosity that there now exists between these two former partners who ran together in Blue and White.
Well, for everybody's sake, let's hope this will be resolved shortly. This is all happening against the backdrop of the coronavirus. And Israel has not been spared like most countries. It has been praised in many places for its immediate attention to the problem, taking it seriously, lockdowns, very strict guidelines about social distancing and gathering in public places, etc. But now it seems that with the flattening of the curve and with the new data that's coming out. Israel will be going back to work, as we say. We are experiencing here in the United States. It's a little bit differently, much larger country. We have 50 states, and some states the virus has been more virulent than in other places. But in Israel, it seems that there is now the opening of some retail, people going back. How is that working?
Yeah.
I can tell you from here that we're actually, before that actually happens, we're going into a lockdown situation during Independence Day, actually also beginning tomorrow. So before we really feel some of these things coming online, including the reopening of the school system, which will begin with the younger grades and then hopefully progress to the older grades. We still have these couple days of very intensive lockdown because I think the Prime Minister wanted to make another push, at social distancing during these days when usually people come together on Memorial Day and also Independence Day. So making one last push to keep people apart and keep the virus under control. After that, we'll see the easing. They're already promising on Thursday, Friday, that people will be allowed to travel distances in order to engage in some kind of physical fitness or physical activity outside that I'm excited about. I can get back to my hiking, hopefully. So there's a lot of promise also that the doomsday predictions did not come true. The need for thousands and thousands of machines, breathing machines and other things that did not come to fruition. Perhaps because Israelis took the regulations seriously and we were able to prevent infection. So we're looking, I think, towards a brighter future as things ease up. But of course, there's a lot of apprehension about how society will change in the long run. What businesses will not be able to reopen? How many people will remain unemployed? Of the more than 1 million people who are now unemployed, is more than 25% of the workforce. So there's light. Seems to be light at the end of the tunnel, but still very great apprehension.
Yeah, Omri, you've seen it now from both sides. You see it from the Israeli side, and then you're here in the United States, here in Washington, covering the coronavirus here. So what are your observations on this?
I think that Israel acted very forcefully and acted fast, and measures that seem maybe, pretty harsh a few weeks ago now really pay off when you see the curve in Israel is really like they were able to crash the curve in a matter of few weeks. And, unlike the US, in Israel, there was actually enforcement of this lockdown. You could see cops on the street, you could see Mishmar HaGvul on the street, and these are really pictures that we don't remember in the near past in Israel, seeing the police on the street asking you how far are you from your house, and if it's more than 100 meters, you could get a 500 shekel fine, which again, for many people sounds like a crazy idea a few weeks ago, but when people took it seriously and stayed home for 5 or 6 or 7 weeks, you can see now the Israeli economy on the way to reopen in the very near future. And again, you can also make the case that in the US, it's a different scale. It's 50 different states, and every state can make its own decision. So it's really different system. It's not very simple as in Israel. But the fact of the matter is that the public in Israel took the directions very seriously. People did not play games. People listened to the guidelines, and they practiced social distance. I know, from my family, with my mom and my siblings not going to meet her for a few weeks, it was very hard for all of us. Also, we did the Seder on Zoom and everything. But you can now really see that it pays off when we really hope that the peak is behind us.
Well, we really hope so, both here and in Israel and everywhere else. that curves will flatten and cases will go down, and we'll all be able to get back to our routines, but not until it's safe, of course. So it's, but we have been watching the Israeli example, which really has been praised, and of course we're also trying to do our best here. I mean, I see it where I live. I live in a large a condominium building, and people are very careful about social distancing, about getting in the elevator with other people, about congregating in the lobby, about getting their food deliveries at a table outside, and all of those things. And we hope that, as you've said, as in Israel, it will pay off, and will pay off here as well.
Well, just to clarify, I don't think it's like a criticism about the U.S. system, because it's different system with 50 different states. It's much harder to coordinate. And what do you do when a person is crossing state lines? And if someone lives in Virginia and he traveled to Maryland or to DC, it's way more complicated to enforce everything. Whereas in Israel, it's one state, one police and everything. So it's not a criticism about the US, but the fact of the matter is that Israel acted very fast. And
indeed. Well, thanks to you both, to Omri Nahmias of the Jerusalem Post, and to our own Alan Schneider for joining me today. We'll, of course, continue to keep up on the progress as Israel seeks to establish a new government. Hope that we can call on you both in the near future, perhaps when the government is actually in place, to talk about some of the important personnel and to talk about its policies going forward. If you like what you've heard so far, make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to visit our website, b'nai-b'rith.org, to learn about our work. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @b'nai-b'rith. For my guests, Omri Nahmias and Alan Schneider, I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time. Take care, everyone.